We'll mute.
Good morning, everybody. If you haven't done so already, could I ask you to please mute yourselves? That would be wonderful. So I have entitled this morning's lesson, Now Run, with an exclamation mark. If you wouldn't mind, would you please open up Hebrews chapter 12 with me? The main emphasis this morning, just because there are so many beautiful things we could focus on, I had to choose something. So I chose Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3 to focus on primarily. And I bet you lots of you smart girls have actually memorized this by now. And so I will read it out for us. And if you're muted, feel free to read it out or say it out from memory along with me. I'm reading from the ESV. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So, we know by now that the book of Hebrews is written to a group of people who are so beaten down with difficulties and troubles and suffering that some of them are ready to give up. Some of them are being tempted to quit their respective races. I think the book of Hebrews is like intense coaching from the sidelines, if you will. Literally, one from their very cloud of witnesses calls out loudly to spur these current runners on. And we get to spy on it. We get to hear the same loud coaching from the sidelines that they got to hear as we run our races. I think the author wants his readers to understand how to become the kind of runners who can cope with the brutal realities of the race. And I think maybe the climax of the author's entire argument can be found in this chapter. And maybe becoming people who can handle trouble, who can handle the brutal realities of life, is more necessary for us now than it ever was before for these readers. Has there ever been a culture with a lower pain threshold than us? Has there ever been a culture where people scream faster? What would our forerunners have thought about a concept like the trigger space in universities and college campuses across the world? Today I'm going to focus on two main categories of what I hope we can all learn together. Concept number one is I want us to be able to know our race. I want us to know our course. I want us to know what our race is supposed to look like, and I want us to know what our race is not supposed to look like. And the other category that we're going to focus in on is running tips and tricks. So those are our two things if you're taking notes: know your race and running tips and tricks. So the author here introduces the metaphor of a runner in a race this week to illustrate for us the nature of the Christian life. We run the race of faith, and something I learned that I found very interesting this week is the word race is the Greek word agon, A-G-O-N, from which we get our English word agony. Isn't that interesting? So then life, according to this verse, is at times an agonizing struggle. Take that prosperity gospel, small g. Let the lie of the prosperity gospel be dispelled in our lives now. Because it is a lie, ladies, that the Lord only wants health and wealth while we're here on this earth. The Bible is very, very clear on this point. And so the Greek word that we look at here, it can mean a race, and most often does, but it can also mean a wrestling match or a contest. So if we go all the way down to verse 4, where it says, In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. We can learn more about the genre of race that we're called to run. And so what this verse means is probably that if you haven't yet suffered persecution to the point where you're asked to die for your faith, it probably does mean that. But I think that there is nuance to this verse and that it means more than it seems that it means upon first glance. I think it's just as possible that there's a double meaning here that we don't pick up immediately because we don't know ancient Greek. The race that is being discussed, or the metaphor that is being brought here to our attention, is not just a race in general, I don't think, but maybe the Greek pentathlon in particular. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. Pentathlon. So what this particular race was, is in the Greek mindset, it was considered the ultimate race. It was the climax of the Olympics. It had running, it had a marathon, but it also had other things. Jumping, discus, javelin. And then the climax of the pentathlon was a kind of wrestling match or a boxing match. And on the combatants' hands were these kind of hard leather gloves. And what they did is they protected your hand, but they were also there to disfigure and to bring out the blood on your opponent. It brought out blood. And so today we're going to look more deeply at this very cheerful metaphor for life. It isn't just a marathon. It is that too, and that's important that we know that. But life is an agonizing struggle. Not always, not at every juncture, not at every leg of the journey, but at times it will be. It is a regimen of difficulties, and we need to know this going in. When I had a younger, more cooperative body, I was able to participate in a couple of marathons, or sorry, let me be clear, half marathons. And what my racing buddies and I would do is we would come into the new city where the race was being hosted, and we would always, as our step one, get in our rental car or whatever it was we were traveling in, and we would drive the course. We wanted to know what it was that we would need to contend with later that weekend. We wanted to know how hilly this thing was. We wanted to know if there were portions of it that would be trail or gravel. These things are really important. It's important for you to be able to know in advance what it is that you need to deal with. What race have you entered, sister? What race have you not entered? Maybe your race is hilly. Maybe you're on a trail run. It's important that we know in advance what it is we've signed up for. So in fact, if we go so far down into verse 11 in Hebrews chapter 12, where it says this, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. We learn new things, don't we? Peace for those who have been trained by it. The word train here is the Greek word gymnazo, from which we get our English word gymnasium or gym. And I think it's saying here that when the difficulties of life overwhelm you, when troubles overwhelm you, when sometimes tragedies overwhelm you, you feel like everything is out of control. But listen to this. Just because it is not your plan does not mean that there is no plan. So if we look at the metaphor like this, we can learn some things about this race. The first thing we learn is that sufferings are necessary. They're necessary. The Lord God calls them so, and so they are. Are you a woman who understands this? Don't swoop in for your loved ones to remove their sufferings for them. Far be it from you to decide which are and are not necessary for them to go through. John Newton says, everything is necessary that he sends. Nothing can be necessary that he withholds. Everything that is hard, the trials that are across your path, the storms that come, God calls necessary. Nothing can be necessary that doesn't come into your life. And you know what, friends? My belief in the truth of this was tangibly tested 2 times this week. And I knew because of you waiting for me on this Thursday morning that I was going to have to walk what I talked. Just knowing that you would be here, you helped me in my race this week. It was in my power 2 times to swoop in for loved ones, to remove pain, and I'm sure it would have been bad for me and for them if I had done so. I think the pain needed to land where it did, and ladies, you made me stronger to do the right thing. I think it's a hard saying though, isn't it? Everything that hurts that comes into our lives is necessary. There's nuance to the biblical teaching on suffering. The other thing for us to consider about the Bible's teaching on suffering is that God hates the evil and the suffering in this world. God did not create evil and God did not create suffering, but he uses it. I always think of Genesis 50, verse 20 on this point. Do you remember Joseph? He was the ultimate favorite in his family, wasn't he? Jacob, his dad, poisoned that family system because he was absolutely doting on Joseph with favoritism. He spoiled him at an incredible level. Joseph, I think, may well have been on his way to being an evil, proud, incredibly self-absorbed, and therefore miserable young man. And what did God do? He used the jealousy of his brothers to get Joseph to be sold into slavery. And then he used the lust of Potiphar's wife to get him into prison. God used the external brokenness on the internal brokenness. Because in the end, Joseph became a great man, a man who knew himself, a man who was wise, a man who was humbled before his God, a man who was strong, a man who knew his own heart. He knew the hearts of other people, and he became this great man. He saved his family in the end. And when he reflects back on all of those trials, the Lord did not exempt him from, did not release him from. In Genesis 50, verse 20, this is what he says to his brothers. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. And so you can trust that God has planned your race course today, sister, no matter how circuitous, no matter how random it seems from your human vantage point. He planned it exactly this way. Those hills are precisely where he meant for them to be. If we look back at the Garden of Eden, we can see the world that God really did create, the world God really did intend. And we, because of the way in which we have behaved, have brought evil and suffering into the world. And God is going to incredible lengths to end the evil and the suffering eventually. I find it telling and illuminating to look at the scene when Jesus Christ stood before the tomb of Lazarus, his friend who had died. You'll note, friends, that he did not say, well, all things work together for the good of those who love God. What did he do instead? He wept. And we're told, and many of the English translations sort of mute this point, we're told that he wept and he was angry. The Lord was angry at death and suffering. And the knowledge of that comforts me in the middle of COVID-19. Today, may it comfort you. Do you know what an exercise is? It's taking a muscle and it's making it hard for that muscle to do its job. An exercise is opposition, doing something to oppose the way your body works and putting stress on it. And unless that happens to that muscle, it's going to be flabby and unhealthy. That muscle is going to be weak and atrophied. It's going to be shrunken and useless. And therefore, just as physical exertion, physical pain, actually, in some cases, the pain of training is absolutely necessary for our health. So there is a sense in which everything is necessary that God sends to challenge us spiritually. Your faith will never grow if it's not tested. Your commitment will never grow unless it's threatened. Your patience will never grow unless it's taxed, you young homeschooling mothers. Your courage will never grow unless it's challenged. In the gym, when I am weak, then I am strong. And do you know what I mean by that? If you're standing there and you're doing bicep curls, what happens is, as you do more and more bicep curls, you feel weaker as you go. You don't feel stronger. You don't feel triumphant. You feel, I'm not sure if I can do any more of these. Your muscle starts to feel like it's spaghetti. With every curl, you're more keenly aware of your weakness. And I think what this knowledge teaches us is that the weaker you feel, sometimes the stronger you're getting. That's how exercise works. And I think that's how faith works too. Don't expect to feel awash in strength with feelings of strength every moment of your faith journey. Perceived weakness does not necessarily equal failure. I'm going to say that again. Perceived weakness does not necessarily equal failure. If you learn how to run the race with beautiful form, according to Hebrews, if you meet the troubles of life in the right way, as you're going through the suffering, at times you're going to feel like your faith is getting weaker. Your patience is getting weaker. Maybe your courage is getting weaker. You won't necessarily feel in the moment that you're getting stronger, but you are. If you're in Christ Jesus, you are. It's a very illuminating metaphor, this race. Life is a race. Life is a pentathlon. Life with its difficulties is sometimes an agonizing struggle, but the master course designer has planned it all exactly with no mistakes. I think expectations are everything here. How are you going to fare running an ultra marathon if you think you've signed up for a 5K? Not very well. Half or more than half of the pain we experience when difficulties happen isn't maybe due to the difficulties in and of themselves. Maybe it's due to our shock, our confusion. Maybe it's due to our self-pity over the fact that it's happening to us. Maybe half of the pain isn't from the event itself, but from our inability to process rightly. Tim Keller tells this interesting illustration that I think details this really well for us. He says, when you're waiting for a loved one to come out of surgery, they send out a surgical nurse whose job it is to say to you, let me get you ready for what you're about to see when you go in and you see your loved one in the intensive care unit. The surgical nurse paints this horrible picture and she says something along the lines of this. Your loved one will be pale. They might be green. They might be white. They'll be cold. And when you touch them, they're going to be really, really cold. There's going to be blood maybe. There's going to be tubes. Their eyes will be rolling. They probably won't know who you are. On and on and on this surgical nurse will go. They're going to tell you your loved one is going to look awful. They're going to look just awful. And you'll be sitting there sort of stunned as you listen, he says. And then you walk in. And there are two things that can happen to you in that moment once you've been prepared by this surgical nurse. You either say, yeah, it's pretty much just exactly as she has said. Or else you say, well, it's not as bad as she said. It's not as bad as I thought. But the old way, prior to the surgical nurse way, is when you didn't get the surgical nurse and you didn't have this adjustment to your expectations, you would walk in, you would take one look at your loved one lying there, and you would want to faint. You would want to say something along the lines like, oh my gosh, they're dead. It's done. It's hopeless. Everything is done for. Tim Keller says everything has to do with your preparation in this moment. Otherwise, you're going to grow weary and faint-hearted. We need to know our race course. Suffering hurts. Suffering will always hurt, and we're not going to get away from that on this earth. But if we can enlarge our theory of life through the suffering, then we can be the kind of people who can be great in these moments, the kind of person who's able to face things, the kind of woman who can stand and endure, the kind of woman who can keep running. We can be the kind of woman who is trained by the sufferings and not perpetually angry at them or bewildered by them. So now we're going to move on to portion number 2, running tips and tricks. It is a solitary race. It is. But we don't run alone. We don't strive for the crown that only one winner is destined to receive in the end. We strive to finish strong together in our faith. God makes us all winners when we cross that line. And all throughout the book of Hebrews, we read these allusions to the together aspect of this race, the corporate nature of it. And if we peek ahead to verse 15, we read about one more allusion to our communal responsibility in this race. Verse 15 says, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God." We're called to help our sister along, to sling a strong arm around her when we see her limping off to our right or to our left in her race. And I don't know about you, but it shames me to confess that there was a time in my own life where I watched numerous sisters be sidelined and maybe even disqualified from their races. I had drunk the cultural Kool-Aid, and so I thought that calling them out on dangerous error was arrogant. I thought it was mean. I thought it was intolerant, and I thought it was opinionated. And so I was cruelly quiet. I just watched. I believe I will have to answer for that fearful silence one day. I find reading verses like Romans 4:13 reorienting on the teaching of what true kindness looks like in those moments. Romans 14:13 says this, "Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother or a sister." And here's my question to you. Is your silence a hindrance to someone right now? Is your silence a stumbling block for a brother or a sister, perhaps veering off the good way, the ancient path? Only on that path will we and our sisters find true rest for our souls. Help the sister running next to you correct her bad running form if you see it. Have you ever been inspired by the godly example of those who have run the race of faith longer than you have, or more intensely than you are? Has watching them made you want to pick up your pace or apply yourself more diligently? For me, that has been Corrie ten Boom and Darlene Diebler in recent years, and Elizabeth Prentice and Helen Roseveare. Maybe you could ask an admired sister for her recommendations for Christian biography. Because you know what? We learn so much from those who have run the race of faith well. Sometimes it's a current fellow runner, and sometimes it's a sister or a brother who's gone before us. Watching their running form helps us to correct the faulty components of our own. Second point I want to talk about in terms of running tips and tricks, throw off hindrances. What is weighing you down today as you try to draw near to God? What are some of the weights that drag people down in their spiritual journeys? Guilt, maybe anxiety, certain relationships? Do you have a friend that maybe makes sin look kind of glamorous in your life? Are there certain friends around whom you don't like yourself? Maybe it's worth asking yourself why that is. What about legalism? That's a big weight. The endless do's and don'ts of religion. That's going to suck the life right out of faith. Are you carrying around a load of unmet expectations or unnecessary activity that you were never meant to carry to begin with? Would you lay it all down? Would you throw it off? A weight is anything that dampens your enthusiasm for the things of God. They're not necessarily bad things. You'll notice in this portion of scripture, they're categorized separately from sin, the sin which clings so closely. Is what you're holding on to a help or a hindrance in your pursuit of the Lord Jesus? And as I thought about it this week personally, I realized anew with chagrin that I've allowed new weights to creep in once more, slowing me down. I had to delete YouTube off of my phone again. I've had to start using pen instead of pencil in my paper calendar to write in my phone-free day each week, because over time, I stopped doing it. What do you need to throw off, sister? Because the weight of it changes your cadence from a beautiful sprint to a bare plod. We're going to delve much more deeply into that into next week's homework. And then there's sin. There's the outright sin, which clings so closely. And for me, this is danger zone. This danger zone for me is the pantry. It's the kitchen these days. Do you find yourself cooking incessantly for your family, baking incessantly? I'm baking nonstop these days, it seems. And for me, it's dangerous because of my besetting sin of food gluttony. It's not just that I shouldn't make scones so often. It's the realization that if I'm not going to make scones so often, then the week before, I can't make provision for my flesh in the grocery store by buying the dark chocolate baking chunks. If I win in the store, it means I'm much more likely to win in the pantry. I can't make provision for that anymore. And likewise, I can't make provision to fall into the other sins that so easily trip me up, like pride. I know myself well enough to know the settings and situations in which I've repeatedly become entangled in the ugly cords of my own pride. And I don't want to keep falling on my face. So I have to go into those settings and situations prayed up thoroughly and prepared so I won't fall into that sin again. I can't be casual about it, and I can't set myself up to fail thinking, oh, I'm going to be stronger this time. I'm not going to be stronger next time. That's what Romans 13:14 means, I think, when it says to make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. So where do you need to stop making provision for your flesh this week? How do you need to change so that you're going to become a faster runner? Now, I don't know how this is going to work, girls, because our meeting says we have less than 1 minute left. Mary Jane, is it possible for you to restart the meeting and we can continue on? Yeah, thumbs up.
So
let me know.
Everybody would have to go back to the original link and click on it again.
Okay.
And I can do that, but it's 5 to 10, so it's 2 minutes to 10.
Okay, so no problem if you can't do that, but we're going to record the rest of this message and we will post it on YouTube. Okay, so I'm going to give you tip number 3, and it's enter the race, and I'm going to do that after Mary Jane starts the next meeting.
Okay.
So goodbye to those of you who need to leave. We love you.